Hi, I'm Harford County Executive Bob Castley, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street podcast, featuring in-depth interviews and discussions with state and county leaders on the issues that affect us all.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson and Dominic Butchko. Today we are going to talk about energy. Obviously, it's a big issue. We had some big bills drop. There are lots of rate hike worries across the state. We know there are a lot of concerns about generation. The state wants to make sure we have enough clean sources. So we're going to walk through the package that was introduced this week by leadership, and again, covering a multitude of energy issues between the three bills. Michael, I'll turn it over to you. We have Dom with us as well, but are you excited to get into energy issues? I know this one is a hot topic around Annapolis.
Well, it definitely is a hot topic, and that's saying something. Like we're in the early stages of a session where the state's got a $3 billion budget problem, and still there's like a crackle in the air, forgive the pun, because electricity and power generation and adequacy on our grid and electric bills and where do you find clean energy and all these issues have taken their own sort of, not quite center stage maybe with all the fiscal stuff going on, but like this is a big topic. It's a big topic in Maryland for a number of reasons, and those issues cross both of your portfolios. So Dom, you're MACO's lead for all sorts of land use issues and also environmental stuff. So when it comes to the siting of facilities, you've been in the driver's seat working with stakeholders at the county level and being engaged on these issues going back for a couple of years now. And Kevin, some of this is financial too. So some of this connects to taxes and things of that nature, which undergird our ability to deliver local services. So I'm interested in talking through this stuff, and I want to learn along the way. Does that sound like a good way to do this?
I like it.
Love it. Let's jump in.
Right. So first, I guess what I might say is we wrote a piece on the Conduit Street blog this past week, and it's gotten a fair amount of traffic. Just we tried to bundle this whole thing together. Big press event from legislative leaders from both chambers of the General Assembly, basically saying it's time for us to target energy policy in multiple ways. So I kind of want to get into talking about the bills, but at first I want to talk about why are people talking about electricity? Why are people talking about power and generation and transmission and so forth? Why is this a top level topic? So Dom, you've had your finger on the pulse of a bunch of this stuff. Does all of this start with the transmission line that's being proposed to come across Maryland, or has that just kicked an already hot topic into a higher gear?
So that issue has definitely kicked an already hot topic into a higher gear. Energy issues in Maryland have been big for decades, but kind of the scope or the start of our current problem, you can probably go back about, 10 to 15 years. Maryland has historically tried to be a more renewable energy heavy state, which some of our neighbors have not done. And in that transition to renewables, we've had two things happen. First, we've had a deprioritization of fossil fuels generally, but then also the markets have shifted, which means that, the coal plant, which normally would run our power, just isn't profitable anymore, probably isn't getting those subsidies. And the focus has been put on renewable generation. But renewable generation hasn't seen the uptick in development that was originally forecasted. And so that's where the crux of our issues are right now. To compound that a little bit, and more than a little bit, actually, you've seen just an explosion in the data center industry in our neighbor to the south in Virginia. And that is just a sponge for power, which means all folks across the PJM, which is the region we're in, it includes Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, I believe all the way goes up to New York, and then goes all the way west to Illinois. It's a big region, but that kind of sucking of power in Virginia has really started to see rates increase across this broad swath of the country.
Right. So I guess those are some of the issues. And to start with, that this is not an exclusive to Maryland subject matter. is probably important here. Like, we're not on an island facing a little bit of concern about energy policy. We're a state that we've tried to be active with the standard for where you generate your electricity to sell it in the state and so forth. But we're not the only state who's looking at capacity on the grid and how do you satisfy the needs of high level users and so forth. So that's a multi-state regional issue. It's across the country. It's not just in our Northeast region where this is a concern. So Kevin, I know you have been involved in a number of cycles of trying to promote clean energy and trying to come up with sort of taxation policy that makes sense for energy generators and contributors to the cycle and so forth. You've been seeing this on the other side, not just land use, but also on the finance side and sort of the business operations as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think first of all, there is a lot of discussion about particularly solar energy when it comes to tax issues. And MACO's stance has always been we'd much rather see solar on brownfields, gray fields, rooftops, parking canopies than we would on wide swaths of ag land, particularly with our prime and productive soils, right? So we've been at the table and we've agreed to tax breaks for these projects that are installed in those locations. And again, trying to avoid wide swaths of ag land. So I think there's a good debate on, what the taxes should look like for the solar equipment that is actually used to generate revenue and provide clean energy. And I think that it should depend on where these projects are. So again, if you're on less desirable lands, I think that counties would be much more willing to engage in conversations about tax breaks. But what we've seen recently is sort of a blanket proposal to severely limit the amount of tax that these folks would need to remit, the people who are operating these giant solar facilities and making a lot of money. They feel like they shouldn't be taxed on this stuff because Maryland needs more clean energy and they're here to provide that. I think from a county government perspective, though, we use things like pilots, so payment in lieu of taxes, to help give these folks a break. But to say that they shouldn't pay taxes, I mean, in my mind, counties should not have to choose between hosting renewable energy and funding local services, right? We need a fair fiscal framework for this stuff. It does generate a lot of money. We're trying to pay for things like the blueprint, public safety, all the things that we do every day, and especially the blueprint, right? So in our mind, we're looking for a fair framework. We want to host renewable energy across the state. We'd like to do it, again, on more less desirable lands. But I think generally, we're just looking for a fair framework here so that, we can provide that clean energy, but also make sure that we can fund essential services across the state. So there's been a lot of back and forth about it. And I think we can probably get into a little more with the proposal that we've seen just last week.
Right. I think we can. I want to unpack one item that you mentioned, Kevin, because you used a couple of sort of insider terms, and I want to make sure that our listeners understand what we're trying to talk about here. But the idea of, well, where would be desirable places? Like if you had your druthers, where would be your first choice to have a big, wide deployment of lots of solar capacity? And like the idea of a brownfield site or a gray field site or that sort of thing, what we're kind of talking about there are a brownfield is an insider term for usually like industrial areas that have basically suffered from their heavy use, and now the land is not in great condition. It would be hard to build homes there. It would be hard to put a school or a park there. Brownfields are usually areas that would need a lot of reclamation effort in order to be turned over for new productive use. But heck, if you've got a wide open area that's hard to use, that seems like an ideal place to go out and throw up some array of solar panels and let's capture energy there because it's hard to use that land anyway. And similarly, rooftop, it's the same philosophy. The reason why folks like local leaders have been saying, let's try and find incentives for rooftop is these are areas that are already developed. We've already got a plan for how to use that land. You don't have to revisit or upend your land use plan. You just stick something on top of the parking garage or the industrial building or the school or whatever, right? So in both cases, the idea being let's find flat spaces where we don't have to take a right-hand turn in order to put out some solar panels.
So
Right.
Michael, actually, I was gonna say, Michael, I think that, in the spirit of giving our listeners some background on this, I think there's some additional context that's just really important to this conversation. So we're talking right now about solar, and there's a lot of debate going on about what type of actual renewable energy source should we have in Maryland. And so just kind of for everyone's background, the issues right now between like solar versus natural gas and nuclear, solar takes up a lot more physical space than you would a traditional kind of energy generating plant. You need acres and acres to kind of soak up that sun and convert that into electrons, versus nuclear or natural gas. And then same thing kind of with wind. You can only put up one windmill, but you need a multitude of windmills somewhere offshore or in the mountains or somewhere else. And so it's the fact that these two sources in particular just take up so much more square footage comparative to some other energy alternatives.
I think that's so. As our listeners can tell, the reason we've got this as a multi-way conversation is these policies bleed over. Some of it is fiscal. Some of it is sort of the ability to pencil out a project and make it look attractive for a private scale developer to say, okay, we can run this business here in this location and sell the energy we generate at a profit and do well with it. But then it's also like it turns right into a debate about, well, what land are you going to use to make that work? And how does that fit with the community surrounding it? And that's where this gets complicated, both in terms of revenue for public services and safety and education and all the things that local governments have to provide for our communities. But then at the same time, the look and feel and continuity and history character of our land use is a big part of what communities charge their local leaders with delivering and protecting. So these issues are in a weird confluence of all this policy stuff. It's why it's interesting stuff at the very least.
It's very interesting. And you touched on this, but another element is just, the look, smell, continuity of communities. If you're a local elected official and, one of these projects wants to come, and let's say it's a big solar project and it's going to be on a bunch of ag land and people are going to have to see it, right? They're going to have to see it every day. They're going to have to drive by. Maybe they can see it from their house. If you're an elected official at the local level and you're having a public hearing on this proposed project, and 100 people show up and say, no, we don't like it, and no one comes to say we like it, what are you supposed to do, right? And I think so being an elected official right now, being in that seat is really tough, because most of the time when you have these projects that are proposed, you have a public hearing and overwhelmingly the community comes out and say, they say, we don't want it. We don't like it for whatever reason. It creates glare. We don't want to look at it. And it's understandable, right? You can also understand how something like that could, drive down your property value. So being an elected official right now and trying to deal with this is a tough spot, especially when your constituents are telling you no, but the state is saying yes, right? And so you're in a really tough position. You're representing your constituents, but at the same time, again, we are trying to be good actors. We're trying to make sure the state can live up to its renewable energy goals. But at the local level, it's a really tough conversation and a really tough spot to be in.
Well, and Kevin, to kind of build on that, putting the constituents aside for a second, I mean, as counties, what do we do every day? We're implementers. We are on the ground in the community, largely carrying out state policy as well as local policy. And what we're seeing right now is, and we've been saying this for over a year now, is that we're seeing a major conflict between competing state goals. Maryland, for decades, has invested billions, and that's plural with a capital B, billions of dollars into land conservation, particularly around our agricultural areas. And that has been a priority for decades. But now that we're having energy issues, some of those priorities are starting to shift. And what we're seeing at the local level is we're not getting clear guidance on, all right, what is now the new priority? If multiple things are a priority, nothing's a priority. And so that's causing confusion just on the practical implementation side, especially, again, considering we have invested billions, both county, state, and federal dollars since the 1960s.
Right. And Dom, one of the things, I mean, you mentioned the competing priorities, affordable housing is a big one, right? And so we only have so much land available. The state, and we understand, and counties understand too, we do have a housing affordability crisis. There are many reasons for that, but the state, if they want us to, build more affordable housing, at the same time, plant more trees, at the same time, build more renewable energy projects, at the same time, there's not enough money for school construction to support all these new units. So there are a number of challenges locally, a number of competing issues. I agree with you, Dom. And I think the state really needs to focus on, what is the number one priority? And that's a tough question, because these are all very important issues. But when you're trying to look at all of this locally and seeing all these bills and these new mandates coming down and trying to balance the books and also balance your land use policy, there are a lot of things coming at you right now. And it's difficult to try and, I think, prioritize what the state wants us to do with all of these different things. But if you pull one lever over here, there are going to be effects over there, and all of these things will conflict. So I agree, Dom, that's a really good point. I think particularly when it comes to affordable housing, we only have so much land in this state, and we need to try and figure out what the priorities are.
That's a pretty good capsule of the broad issue that, this is the Mako podcast, and we talk about county government issues. So from the point of view of just the county government and their functions, this has been sort of an important but kind of in the background issue for a number of years. This dates back to, the 2016, 17, 18, 19 were the first several years Mako started hearing from our member counties that we have developers coming in and talking to our farmers and saying we want to buy up plots of land. That triggered a series of lawsuits about, well, to what degree are these kind of projects subject to local planning and zoning? And the Maryland courts basically really fenced us in on this. Like, Dom, you're familiar with the perennial case, which right now is basically the guiding concept in Maryland law, but that mostly said this isn't your ordinary planning and zoning matter that the town or the county has to sign off on if you want to get this thing. This is a different ball of wax, right?
Correct. It's a totally different ball of wax. And what's confusing, especially for the folks that we represent, and you kind of alluded to this, Michael, normally if you have a land use issue, if you have a problem with a development in your community, you go to your local elected official, and they're the ones that can, take the consideration. We have this process we go through. Everyone's familiar with it. We've been doing this process forever. And then, you can get your input and have your problem solved. Energy is fundamentally different, especially since the perennial case, where above 2 megawatts, which is relatively small. What's 2 megawatts? 1 megawatt for context is about 3 to 5 football fields when we're talking about solar specifically. Different source, you're going to have a different footprint. But for solar specifically, 1 megawatt, about, again, 3 to 5 football fields. So anything above 2 megawatts, so you're talking 6 to 10 football fields roughly, big project. Anything above that or bigger, there's a whole kind of level of review and processing at the state level through the Public Service Commission. And importantly, that project still has to go through the local process. That being said, if it's found to not comply with whatever local requirements, the Public Service Commission has the authority and almost always does overrule the local jurisdiction on what our objections are. Now, there's a lot of little points throughout that entire application process where we can kind of put up a red flag and say, no, there's an issue here and we have concerns there. And the Public Service Commission and the Power Plant Research Program, which is the entity that actually reviews these applications before they're officially approved or denied, they do talk with local officials. That being said, though, there are numerous examples of we are going to raise an issue and we're powerless to actually make a decision on it because we are preempted.
Right. And I do feel duty bound, Michael, because you mentioned perennial, that, Mako was not asleep at the wheel. And we actually had a legislative initiative that said, no county is going to say no. But what we'd like to do is develop areas where solar would best fit in our local communities. And this would be, they'd be adjacent to power lines. They'd be in areas that, the county agreed, put it over here. Please just don't put it over here. For whatever reason, we'd like it here. So every county would develop a map and they would submit that to the state. And that would sort of be, here's where you can put solar in X county. That was rejected by the General Assembly. But again, counties have been trying since before then, to work with the state to make sure that no county is saying no, but we want to have some local control about where these things go. Counties understand their communities better than anyone. Local elected officials represent their constituents. All of that would be done with local input. So we've been at the table trying to work on this stuff for a long time. I know that counties catch a lot of flack at the local level, but the reality is there are a lot of other factors that go into this. And from a county government perspective, again, we've been trying to thread this needle. We've come up with solutions, but unfortunately, we've not been able to. The General Assembly has not bought into them. But I think that's a big reason that where we are today. When you strip all the local control away, obviously that's going to be a big deal. Communities are going to have strong feelings about that. And this issue is just, we need energy. We get it. But I think that people feel like this is just fast and furious, and they have no control anymore about what their communities look like, feel like, or any kind of continuity.
Okay, if we bracket together some of the things that you two have just talked about to pull this together, like to get our listeners up to speed to where we've been on this issue, it's sort of like, okay, if the powers that be would say, really, the perfect place to put a whole bunch of solar would be on those industrial sites, on those big flat roofs, and the built up areas that are already in use. Problem is, those areas, it's harder to get the land or to buy the rights or to get access to run cabling and so forth to a development that you would have to build and install on top of a parking deck or something along those lines. So that sounds like a good idea, but for the most part, we haven't seen those kind of projects really launch as widespread as maybe you'd like to see. And instead, the market has been favoring where can you buy flat, cheap land that's out in the sunshine that can pick up a lot of rays. And the answer is generally, let's look into the more rural parts of the state and look at farmland. And it's your best farmland is nice, flat, and exposed to the sun. That's a great place for growing corn or tomatoes or soybeans or whatever. It also happens to be exactly the right demographics for the geography of this is where you want to be able to put up solar panels to get the maximum exposure, and the land is relatively cheap. It's the land in Caroline County in the middle of the Eastern Shore is just cheaper than the inside the Beltway developed parts of Prince George's County. That's market forces, not taxes, not policy, but it all points in the direction of the development pressures have been in the rural parts of the state, although that's growing and growing in other parts of the state too. And this is moving toward the suburban belt and closer to the downtown areas. So that's kind of where we've been. Is that a fair summary of kind of what gets us to the county issues and the siting stuff as a component of this sort of puzzle piece array of different things going on with energy policy? Is that about right?
So the one thing I will add to that, Michael, that's kind of important context, and as our listeners can clearly tell, this is not a very simple issue. It's a complicated web. But to make matters worse, there's also the question of transmission. And so you have to buy the flat land. As you were totally hit the nail on the head, this is very much economics driven. And in our rural areas that are flat and both the land is cheap, the numbers pencil out a lot better than they do in downtown Bethesda on a parking lot. The other side of this, though, is where's the transmission capacity and where can we put that? And so there hasn't been, a single plan. And that's kind of one of the issues we're seeing right now with the PJM and all these conversations. There's not really an even, easy plan where you can say we have transmission over here on this side and we can put it there. A lot of this infrastructure is scattershot. Some of this information is protected because it's, trade secrets, other stuff, it's national security. But like identifying where the capacity is on the lines so that we can more easily plan and implement a rollout has been an immense challenge to getting this rollout of renewable energy right.
Right. And I would say one other thing, Michael, is this, that, we keep talking about farmland, and yes, it's much cheaper to do it that way, and that's the driving reason as to why developers prefer it. But then you get into the question of, well, what is that land now, and what do you call it? Is that agricultural? Is that, are you going to assess it as commercial? Because now you have solar panels. Is that farming? Is it commercial? Is it ag? There are just a lot of debates about that and how much the property is actually worth, and then what the taxes should be. But so that also plays into this, and I think not just with energy, but with other things, doing commercial activity on ag land and wanting to be taxed as if you're ag is another issue that kind of seeps into here when it comes to this entire debate. But reality is, I mean, and from my perspective on the fiscal side, we need to fund services. We have a ton of pressure, just like the state. And so if we start picking and choosing winners and losers to, these people don't need to pay taxes because they provide this great service. But over here, you're going to pay. Everybody's going to want the same deal, right? And so I think we're just trying to figure out, again, a fair way to do this, making sure that we're appropriately valuing land and taxing appropriately. And again, counties have the ability right now through those payment in lieu of tax agreements, and most do, to work with developers to give them a break so that they're not paying full freight, but that they are contributing to the community. Because again, these people are making a lot of money. They're not doing this out of the good of their heart.
So this is all right. This is now getting to sort of the point of the issue of the moment. This stuff's tricky enough. The things that we've talked about, Maryland wants to generate more relatively close by clean energy. We've got a variety of goals we want to reach on that front, and that's challenging. It's tough to find the right location. It's tough to figure out what the right process is to approve those locations. All that kind of stuff is tricky. This has been a multi-year challenging issue for the legislature. I don't think we've had a year go by in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years that there hasn't been at least a few different bills with different ideas about what to do with siting energy sources, or who should make the decision, all that kind of stuff. So that's tricky enough. Now you add to that, we'll start with our own state, Maryland. Maryland has always been a producer of less energy than we consume. So we've got lots of people, we've got a fair amount of industry, and we've got a fair amount of high electricity users and so forth. We have a number of power plants around the state. We've got one sizable nuclear facility in southern Maryland and a number of sort of legacy plants, coal burning, oil burning, and so forth. I've forgotten the specifics, but 8 or 10 or 12 major sized facilities. A lot of them are closing in on sort of timing out their normal life cycle. And so at the same time that Maryland is a net importer of electricity and our own generation capacity is kind of in question as to what are we going to do next, at the same time, we now have, as you alluded to earlier, Dom, a potential explosion in hunger for power, reliable power by the IT sector. This idea that artificial intelligence is spawning lots and lots and lots of development that are high aggressive IT users. They need lots and lots of number crunching capacity. They need lots of data centers and things like that. The first big wave in our region actually wasn't in Maryland, but in Northern Virginia, but they're part of our multi-state region. And so they need to draw enough energy to run those facilities, and people are hungry for more. Everybody wants to use all these AI tools. All these companies out there want to, their next big steps count on having the energy to drive AI and to drive all these applications that we all love and adore and want to use and so forth. So you put all this stuff together, and a campus of data centers in Philadelphia is saying we need as much energy as the entire city of Pittsburgh. And no one really had that on their bingo card 15 years ago, that we would have this explosion in demand. So now, just being able to price out energy to put it onto the grid for normals like us to use in my monthly bill at home is a tricky proposition, right? That's what we've been seeing in the last few months, is the prospects for energy bills to go way up for folks who use electricity, right?
100%. I mean, the explosion in the data center industry is just a major catalyst for this. And I don't think that point can kind of be underscored enough. Additionally, especially in Maryland, but this is not only a Maryland issue, as we've been transitioning away from a fossil fuel economy and more towards electrification, which means your stove is now electric, your car is now electric. So many things that were previously natural gas powered or coal powered or whatever are now going to just be electric, these things that are everyday facets of our lives, that's also growing demand in a way that we really didn't expect. And so the crazy thing is, too, the uptick in that transition has not been going as fast as initially predicted, which means that if we do continue down this electrification path, which, all intents and purposes, it looks like Maryland will continue down that path, this demand is just going to get worse without data centers, just on running a society on a new form of energy consumption.
Yeah, no doubt. And data centers are a big part of this for sure. Every day, it seems like the capacity and the power of these applications are growing every day. So Virginia has a ton of them. That's what's driving the need for the Piedmont Reliability Project that's going to come down through multiple counties in Maryland and power those data centers in Virginia. Maryland, I think, would love to host more data centers. Frederick County, they've been working with their developer, and they're going to have a data center there, but they do draw a ton of power. They draw a ton of water. There are a lot of environmental concerns, and we've seen that play out. I think Frederick County has done a great job, but generally the data center industry wants to be in Maryland because of its proximity to Northern Virginia. So we don't have the capacity right now. It's hard to imagine that we could have an explosion of data centers in the state right now, but there's no doubt that the data center industry is driving a lot of this. And like Dom said, I mean, the push to move to EVs and electrification generally, that's putting a ton of pressure on the utilities and on the market. And I think utilities, you're seeing skyrocketing utility rates, which is something that I think, MACO warned would happen too. The industry has warned would happen. But because Maryland wants them to do all these things and we want to change our electricity consumption habits, the utilities are saying, fine, we'll do it, but we're not paying for it, right? We're not going to pay to upgrade all this infrastructure. That's going to be the ratepayers. And so that's the trade-off right now is, if you want to electrify and you want to have, again, change your consumption habits, that's going to cost a lot of money. And now people are starting to feel that in their utility bills. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the action in the General Assembly.
Right. And I think connecting these a little bit, it's not as though this explosion in demand, whether it's because of data centers exclusively or just modern times, everybody likes all of our electronic toys and all of our processors and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is this is happening, right? It's not because state legislatures said, let's start creating data centers and see if there's any market for that. This is happening because consumers are demanding more and more electronic-based services that require servers and calculations and all these kinds of things. So, like, we all want to stream through 19 different services through what used to be our cable company. Now everybody wants to have all these different, and
Right.
Okay, you need to connect to a server, you need to connect to a center that can handle all that capacity. And then I want to have somebody, I want to have the AI bot do all this analysis on my computer so I can understand what's happening in the state legislature. Same thing. I need someplace with all that capacity. Northern Virginia has been a welcome host to some of these places, but it's not like they won't happen. It's not like Maryland can just say, stop the world, I want to get off. This isn't like that. This is happening. It's just a question of where those facilities are going to pop up and who's going to feed them the energy that they require.
100%. And if I could just add on to that, Michael, I think, again, we're talking about issues that are interconnected. What Maryland is seeing with energy is very similar to what Maryland is seeing with housing. There are global, national and regional trends going on that are beyond us right now, but they are no less salient, and we still need to deal with them, at the Annapolis and at the local level. But you're 100% right. And the world is just spinning. Broad changes are happening, and we have to deal with those still.
And on that, with all the demand now, to throw another wrinkle into it, you have the big money fight where the Amazons of the world come in and say, well, you know what, we'll just take Calvert Cliffs offline and we'll just use all that energy to power our data center. And of course, that creates problems with the grid and with regional energy issues. But there are multiple big hitter companies coming to multiple states and saying, hey, just take this power plant offline. We'll take it and we'll power our data center. Of course, again, like PJM, the regional entity, is raising major concerns about what that would mean to grid capacity. But that's the next big fight. The Amazons of the world want to come in and just say, we need the energy, we need it now. We'll pay a lot of money, whatever you want, but we're going to now just take over this generating station, right, and use it for our data centers. And that is, again, very concerning, but it just shows the hunger for energy to power these data centers and these applications that we all love.
And kind of, Kevin, to add on that, I mean, just so everyone gets how big of a deal this is, 3 Mile Island, the facility's name has been changed since then, but 3 Mile Island outside of Pittsburgh was a nuclear energy facility that was decommissioned. It was turned off about 5 years ago, maybe it was a little sooner than that, but that's no longer producing power. Microsoft has enough money to reintegrate and return on a nuclear power plant. And it's not as simple as flipping a switch and all of a sudden, Homer Simpson gets his job back. They have to go through and redevelop some of the facilities. So we're talking tens to hundreds of millions, maybe even more. And they're saying that investment to stand up a historic nuclear energy generating facility is worth it. So imagine what the demand's going to be, in Maryland and in Virginia, where we have this information technology kind of industry growing up, but then also across the country, because this is not a Maryland issue. This is a national issue. Like the scale of that is just immense if you think about it.
Right. So now the stage is set, right? You've had these simmering issues of where do we locate the next generation of generation facilities, like where the next wave that's coming, where are we going to put them and how are we going to get them up and running? What do we do with the old facilities? How do we accommodate all this growing demand and need, especially for these new players who are on the scene and they're thirstier than anybody? And at the same time, the requirement to get power from one place to another, even across these multi-state regions, can be really inconvenient if you live in Carroll County and it's going right through your backyard. So all of this stuff sets the stage. This is why you end up with the Maryland State Legislature, leaders from both chambers stepping forward a few weeks into the session and saying, okay, like we need to have a large scale plan to get into energy stuff. Not all of this is government stuff. Not all of this is, things we do through the state legislature, but we got to try and get a handle on what we can here. And so we saw last week the introduction of 3 separate bills, all with sort of the stamp that this is a package, an effort across different committees and different sponsors, but all in an effort to let's try and nail this stuff down and get Maryland's policy right on this sort of stuff. So the first one I want to speak to is like the big picture. They're calling it the Next Generation Energy Act. And I think this is one sort of talking about, how's Maryland going to get positioned for what's our generation in state going to look like? How are we going to make sure there's capacity on the grid and there's reliably for users who need it today and down the line, right? So this stuff isn't exactly MACO stuff. It's not exactly counter government issues, but it's relevant to all this whole web of things that we've been talking about. So can you speak to that a little bit, Dom? I know there's a lot of things in that bill, but some high points on that?
Yeah, so again, that's a really big bill. Kind of the biggest crux of that issue, two-part. First, when we're looking at generation, we need kind of stable, large-scale generation, and this bill tries to find a medium and long-term answer to that. That medium answer is let's take a serious look at natural gas in the state of Maryland, again, over that medium term, with the thought of we can later transition that potentially to hydrogen or something else later on, but the idea is that it's not permanent. And so those are plants that we can build today. We can stand those up today. Not literally today. It might take a few months to set those up, but they can get put up relatively quickly compared to nuclear. But again, with the idea of we might see some emissions go up, but we'll very quickly transition those. The other side of that bill has to do with nuclear and re-looking at nuclear as a large part of our energy portfolio. And in Maryland, I might get the percentage wrong here, but I believe it's like 40% of the energy in the state of Maryland comes from Calvert Cliffs, and that number might actually be low. That might be higher. But Calvert Cliffs, one nuclear facility, produces a massive share of the energy that we generate in Maryland. And so looking at our challenges right now, looking at the challenges with rollout and transmission and everything else in footprint, nuclear presents a really interesting option. And this has risen to kind of the top of the conversation list more than it probably ever has in probably any of our lifetimes. Probably since the 3 Mile incident, nuclear is there. Now, interesting about what's the difference between granddaddy's nuclear and the nuclear that we're talking about in this bill. The technology has moved on dramatically, and now we can do, small modular nuclear reactors, which basically you can kind of think of them like Lego bricks that generate power, where, we can afford to put 2 Lego bricks here and that might meet our demand, but we know our demand might grow. So in a couple of years, I can put 3 more Lego bricks right there, and you can really build off of each other. But these are smaller reactors that we can, place around. This is going to be a longer term kind of implementation. Most of this technology and the infrastructure itself is being developed in Europe, which means they're going to have to import this nuclear technology. We're probably not going to be able to stand up one of these reactors within the next 10 years. It'll probably be 10 years plus, maybe 8 years, but roughly around then before we can actually get these reactors. But looking long-term, clean power, that's really kind of the broad strokes plan in that bill.
Right. And I'll say, that doesn't come without controversy, right? Natural gas. I mean, just a few years ago, Maryland passed the Climate Solutions Now Act, and that the intent there was to electrify. And so I know that environmental advocates, and that they're going to have a lot of concerns with talks about, even temporarily moving to natural gas to alleviate some of the pressure in the short term. As you said, nuclear is years away. So I think it's smart to start planning, but, the natural gas piece of that is going to be controversial. And quite frankly, I mean, that's also not a tomorrow thing. So I think this is a longer term look. But this bill is not going to alleviate pressure tomorrow or in a few weeks or a few months, even years. This is a longer term look at how we need to start planning and making sure that we don't get ourselves into this situation again, and we have the power to operate these data centers and to do all the other things we need to do, and that we're not seeing spiking energy rates and threats of blackouts and things like that. So I think it's smart, but it's not something that's going to alleviate pressure right now.
Right. So I think this is the bill that really is center stage. We've seen lots of standalone legislation talking about the process for taking land for transmission stuff, thinking about this Piedmont Reliability Project, linking energy sources in Pennsylvania down with heavy users in Virginia that comes through Maryland. There's some degree of what Maryland can do about that project right now, but I think this bill, the Next Generation Energy Act, is trying to say, we got to think about local sources. We got to think about a shorter term plan, not just the infinitely long term plan. I think the emphasis is not so much go back on the proposal to push toward electrification of buildings and vehicles, but rather let's burn natural gas, which is, at least in carbon emission terms, cleaner and more efficient than coal or oil, as a way to generate your electricity for the grid and so forth. So anyway, that's its own big debate. There's another bill that I'll mention relatively quickly because it's a little softer, but the Energy Resource Adequacy and Planning Act is kind of, Maryland needs to have a game plan for on beyond. Right. And we need to be not just waiting to see what the regional entity PJM says, but we in Maryland need to be thinking at the Public Service Commission level, at the state legislature level, at the Energy Administration level, and even at the community level about what are we going to be doing 10 and 15 and 30 years from now. Yes, we may have a plan in place because of the other legislation on sources and what are we going to be certifying and so forth, but the usage and generation plan long term is also a part of this package as well, right, Dom?
Yeah, I hit the nail right on the head. I couldn't have said it better myself, actually.
Okay, so the bill that gets back to the issues that are county government issues, back to these siting matters and so forth, is the bill that's tagged as the Renewable Energy Certainty Act. And that's the title on the bill, but this is one that basically says this should be the game plan for getting these clean energy facilities. Generally speaking, we're talking about solar, getting them up and running and sited and approved quickly, cheaply, get them up and get them profitable and so forth, so we can generate all this clean energy that we want to be part of the portfolio of a reliable source across the state. So back to these issues of, okay, if that's the goal, how do you do that without putting solar onto the Antietam battleground or onto your most productive farmland all across a rural county or things of that nature? And then we're back to those issues of how much community guidance should be part of this, or are we completely at the mercy of our passion for clean energy as soon as possible?
100%. So that bill really touches on all of the local issues. And so kind of to dig into that a little bit more, the bill is broken up into three parts. So first, the first part of the bill talks about solar and how that would be handled. And that's exclusively above 2 megawatts. There's also the second part that has to deal with energy storage. And there's some unique questions there, because as we do want to rely more on these renewables that only generate part of the time, unlike, natural gas or nuclear, which you can turn that on at midnight, you can turn it on at noon, you're going to get the same amount of energy either way. Solar and wind don't have that, which means we're going to have battery storage and deal with a lot of the challenges that come with that. And so this bill kind of lays out a framework for that in there. And then finally, there's a whole section on if counties wanted to kind of stand up their own community solar programs where we would pay for the panels and we would have, subscribers, and all of that would be done in-house by the local government. This kind of sets out a pathway for local jurisdictions to kind of go down and do that. On that first piece, on the solar piece, I think there's some important context that I believe our listeners should be familiar with, but just in case they're not, counties really want to be part of the solution here. As we were talking about before, these are global issues and they're affecting, the whole country, but then the region and also Maryland and all 24 jurisdictions. And so we are really keen on being positive stakeholders. Over the interim, MACO was meeting informally with members of the administration, the environmental community, as well as the solar development community to try and come up and find where the common ground was and what policies can we put in place to kind of address the stuff that Michael, you were just talking about, that community input, the look, smell, and feel of the places that we call home, while also making sure that we can efficiently and effectively roll out solar. Looking at the bill the way it's drafted right now, clearly some of the work that we've done informed that first part of this bill. That being said, there are a number of parts where there's a little bit of divergence, or more than a little bit of divergence, and that might cause a little bit of consternation because, as our listeners can tell right now, it's a delicate balance and it's a question of priorities and where we're at right now.
And I want to just talk generally, John, about the battery storage issue, and just a little quip. When it comes to these batteries, these are not your normal run-of-the-mill batteries, right? And so I know that I've spoken to at least 2 elected officials on the Eastern Shore who have said, hey, when these companies come in here and they build these giant solar installations and they have batteries, that they've straight up told us, hey, if this thing catches on fire, do not call the fire department, because trust me, they don't have the equipment to handle it. You need to call us and we'll have to bring in some specialized equipment. And obviously that is concerning for local elected officials who are responsible for protecting their communities. So Dom, when it comes to the battery stuff, this is something that we've pushed for. There is a work group that was looking at this, but anything in the bill that talks about safety or sprinkler suppression systems, anything like that, because again, that is a big public safety issue that I think needs to be addressed, and there are ways to address it.
So the unfortunate answer to that is, as of right now, no, there's nothing in the bill that addresses safety for these utility scale batteries. And for background, Mako has been at the forefront of this battery safety issue for a number of years. Last year, we actually spearheaded a bill to stand up a commission to make recommendations on these utility scale batteries, because as this becomes a part of our critical infrastructure, we have to do a cost benefit analysis and recognize kind of what additional layers we have to put around this to make sure it's safe. For context, why are we talking about this? Why do batteries matter? These batteries, if they combust, and depending on the type of battery, lithium ion is potentially more combustible than other technologies. But if these batteries catch on fire, they are multiple scales of magnitude more destructive than your traditional, internal combustion engine. If a, car caught on fire, or if a natural gas plant caught on fire, these utility scale batteries, and again, all this depends on the size, but could be scales of magnitude more destructive. You can't just put water on them to put them out. Sometimes you have to use special chemicals. Sometimes you have to try and cover them up and make sure they don't get oxygen. Sometimes you just have to let them go. There's no great answer. There's nothing we can do. So in addition to that massive amount of destruction you're getting from the fire, they also release a massive amount of toxic fumes. And so if we're putting these in a community, or if we're putting these on ag land, and there's worst case scenario, if you don't have adequate fire suppression to first detect it before it fails, and then God forbid if it does fail, be able to respond to that and stop it early on, you're going to have massive kind of long-term implications for wherever community or landscape this happens in.
And so then it falls to local leaders to try and make the case that the rollout of our clean energy future should be done with some balance. I think you each have used that word along the way here, but that's also the sort of keystone word in Mako making this one of our legislative and policy initiatives for this year, was to say a balanced approach to do this stuff is the best way forward. Our initiative is not stop solar. It's rather than green light every single project that could generate some clean energy because we really love clean energy, it should be, let's find the right places, let's find the right spaces, let's do this safely, let's do this in a way that isn't a physical intrusion on the nearby roadway or the people who live right next door and so forth. But you can tick some boxes on the process of making something a sensible fit into an area, without saying, oh, this is going to be a 36-month delay to get your permits from these yahoos in county government who just want to say no to everything. It doesn't have to be the fullest extreme of that whole story.
Yeah, nor should it be, right? And like you said, Michael, I think it's important to note, we're not trying to say no. We understand that we are part of the solution here, and we're looking for reasonableness, we're looking for balance, and we've been doing that for years. And it's frustrating sometimes. I know that counties get some flack, and certainly we've had some hiccups along the way, but I think there are good actors and bad actors in this space when it comes to developers. And some developers come in and they want to work with counties. Some developers come in and straight up say, we don't need you. We're going straight to the state and we're going to preempt you. And of course, that's going to create some feelings at the local level, right? So I think that, again, there certainly have been hiccups along the way. Counties are working through this the best that we can. But to say that, constituents, again, these are shared constituents. These are people that local leaders and state leaders represent. To say that they shouldn't have any input on what's happening in their community, I think is a big step. And I think that we should really worry about that and again, listen to our constituents. We're hearing it at the local level more than state leaders are, because that's, people know their local leaders. They show up to the meetings, and we're trying to relay those concerns, the stuff we're hearing on the ground, and to make sure that there is an avenue for community input. This is where people live. This is where they raise their families. This is where they work. And so they should have some input on what their community looks like and how it functions and just continuity of operations. So we have been, and I love that you said that, Michael, we're not trying to say no, we never have. We are trying to find a balance. We're trying to make sure that we have local input. We're trying to make sure that we just don't get railroaded by the state and by people who aren't on the ground and don't know these communities. So I think that you nailed it, Michael, but that's where we are and where we've always been.
So at risk of beating a dead horse, if I can dogpile kind of on this, I think really the core of what we've been trying to do, especially over the interim, is really just take down the temperature, get everybody on the same page so we're all kind of rowing in the same direction, and set rules of the game that everybody understands. Because right now it's really tense when you talk with elected officials, community members, developers, I mean, everybody. And a lot of that is we just don't have common rules of the road that we've all agreed to. The perennial case that preempted local jurisdictions, again, upended the way we did land use for decades and put that aside, but it did it in a way that there's no longer predictability and there's no longer clarity. And so in order to kind of take down that temperature, we have to have that predictability and that clarity. And we also have to walk and chew gum. We have to balance the fact that we need to get more generation. And we have to balance the fact that these are going to be in our communities. And sometimes we need kind of common sense things to preserve the look, smell, and feel of all of these places that us and our mutual constituents are calling home.
So listeners, friends, if a $3 billion budget crisis is just not your cup of tea and you're looking for something a little more nuanced and a little more complex and sort of a tangled web that's more sophisticated than merely raising taxes, cutting services, shifting costs onto counties, things of that nature, there's another ring of this circus that you can pay a lot of attention to in the back end of this legislative session. Energy policy is hot. It's going to stay that way. This stuff is important and interesting. And the conversations we're having in the state legislature, even though some of these things are kind of above their pay grade, a lot of these discussions are really going to guide what Maryland is doing and how we're living for the next decade, 2, 3 ahead down the road. So this is front row stuff. Pay attention to it. If you're the kind of people who are listening to this podcast, hopefully we've wet your whistle because this is pretty good stuff.
And Michael, just like the budget and the fiscal issues, the $3 billion deficit, it will evolve. So the budget and the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act that everyone hopefully here, our listeners, are familiar with. And if you're not, please go to the Conduit Street blog for all that coverage and energy and everything else. But that will evolve throughout the session. So let's not fall in love with language that's currently in bills or certain policies, because I think just like the budget, this energy debate will continue to evolve. We will see more bills. We'll see bills be combined with one another. And at the end of the day, we'll have to see what this looks like. But there will be a lot more drama coming when it comes to energy, big money fights, small money fights. I think all of this, how it shakes out, is going to be similar to the budget, where, energy might be a sine die issue, right? We could see this come all the way down to the end with as much as going on. You could see that. So don't fall in love with anything that's in current bills. Don't fall in love with the language. It will change. And we're going to make sure and try our best to make sure that we preserve local input and counties, again, having the ability to protect their communities and maintain that continuity locally.
Dom, you want to put a bow on this before Kevin sends us out?
Thank God for job security between now and sine die.
Well, there's a lot in this for our county leaders, for the communities that we're trying to serve. And back to the fiscal side of it, there's a lot at stake for our ability to keep delivering everything the state and our residents are asking for. So all this stuff definitely matters all the way down.
All right. Well, I think we've gotten into this pretty in depth. I'm confident that we will come back during this session and we'll be talking energy again. Dom, thanks so much for your insights. Michael, thanks for playing MC today. A little bit different, but I like it. And if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, as I mentioned before, please make sure you're keeping up with the Conduit Street blog. Every time Mako testifies on a bill, you get the testimony on the blog. All these big issues, we're covering them, the budget, energy, all kinds of stuff is there for you every single day. So please go ahead and read it. It's a great resource. But for Michael Sanderson and Dom Butchko, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.